Hey everyone, Aaron Lovejoy here for Knights at the Game Table, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about airbrushing. The elusive, the wonderful, the thing I hate the most sometimes, the airbrush. And there's a few things you got to know about airbrushing to make the experience more enjoyable. We're going to start off with our air compressor, because we have to have an airflow to our airbrush. So your air compressor, there's several different types. There's the kind that is just the compressor itself. This particular model has the compressor and a tank underneath it for holding your air. Either way, they both work about the same. The things you got to know is your air pressure, how to control it. By pulling up on this dial right here and turning to clockwise, you can up your pressure, and then turning counterclockwise, it lowers the pressure. Let me turn it on here. As you can see, it's fairly quiet, and it's going to start building up air pressure. And we'll just wait till it gets to the top of the air pressure to see what it's at. I personally run my air compressor at 40 psi, which is really high for most people, but I encourage you to try upping your air pressure to around about that area, because it will atomize the paint particles and make smaller dots, basically. All paint that goes through an airbrush comes out in the form of dots. So the higher your pressure, the smaller your dots. This also has a tendency to blow out any clogs before they actually start clogging your airbrush, because your air pressure is just so high. So let's take a look here. This particular compressor is right around about 40 psi. So to make it a little bit higher, we just turn our gauge. It's right at 40. A really good way of testing that to see if it's exactly 40 psi is by spraying your airbrush. See how it went down just a little bit? So I can turn it up even further. So now that's a true 40 psi. Now, if I want to go back down to say 20 psi, because that's a little bit easier to handle for a beginner, you're going to want to turn your thing counterclockwise, or clockwise. Counterclockwise, that's it. And it'll go back down to 20. Now, sometimes the pressure won't go down on its own, and you actually have to blow air out to get it to go down. So either way, it's always best to kind of push down on your trigger and have the air come out, because then you can set your gauge exactly what you want. Now, since I run at 40, I'm going to push it right back up to 40 psi. All right, so that's our air compressor. This is a TC910 compressor from Badger Products, and it's one of the best air compressors around. So now we get to our airbrush. On my hose, I always use a quick release valve. This allows me to disconnect and put a new airbrush in very quickly. I don't have to spin it on and off. Also, if you have several different brands of airbrushes, all of the quick release nozzles on every airbrush will fit into this fitting. So you don't have to worry about different size air hoses and stuff. Typically, everyone likes to get the most expensive airbrush. I know I did. I got a $350 airbrush, and it tended to clog all the time, and it was really hard to learn on. I recommend getting a general purpose airbrush. So general purpose meaning this particular needle is a size 5. On most other companies, it's a size 3. So it's a general purpose needle, and it will spray about a 1/8 inch width spray of paint. Honestly, for what we do on, say, a Space Marine or a smaller figure like this Mangud Timur from Reaper Miniatures, a 1/8 inch spray is small enough. That will put a highlight on a head, it will put a highlight on a shoulder pad, no problem. You don't really need to get any smaller than that. So technically, you could just use a general purpose airbrush permanently. That's the only airbrush you have. And since it has a larger needle, it clogs less often than a high-end airbrush does. And usually they're a bit cheaper, or a lot cheaper. In this case, the Badger airbrush, it can run anywhere from $55 to under $100. So fairly cheap airbrush, really good quality, and it's a workhorse. I built my entire commission-based business on a Badger Patriot 105. The only reason to upgrade from this, in my opinion, is if you're going to be spraying inks, stuff like that, you can get a higher grade airbrush like the Sotar 2020. Now this has a 0.2 needle and it'll spray a much finer dot or a much finer line. And the problem with that is when you have a finer needle, acrylic paints tend to clog your airbrush more. So that being said, a finer needle will clog even more than a Patriot 105. So what I see a lot of times, what happens is people will start off with their first airbrush, end up clogging that airbrush. Instead of learning how to keep it from clogging, they will immediately buy a more expensive airbrush. And I've had friends who have $1,200, $1,500 collections of airbrushes, all of which are clogged, because they never learned how to unclog their airbrush. So that's a little bit something that we're going to go over today. So my first advice, general purpose airbrush. If you're starting off, even if you're an experienced airbrusher, the general purpose airbrush will do you better than a higher end airbrush, and they're cheaper. So a couple things. When I store my airbrush, I always store it with the needle pulled back into the airbrush. In this case, it's already pulled back, but to start airbrushing, I will push the needle forward and set it up against my nozzle. Then I just turn this little nut back here, boom, I'm ready to airbrush. The airbrush itself is pretty simple. You push down on the trigger and that lets the air out. As you pull back, it lets paint through the cup and out the front of the airbrush. So as the needle goes back into the airbrush, paint can come out. So one of the things I use to keep my airbrush from clogging is what's called a hard spray. So let me load this up again, spray it onto my hand, and I'm just going to put a little bit of ink in here at first to show you what a hard spray is. So I'll put a couple drops of ink in there. And a hard spray is basically this. You spray all down on the air and then pull all back on the paint. So boom, 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 just like that. You don't do little sprays, you do big sprays. Bam, bam, just like that. And what that does is it hopefully forces out any paint that's clogging in your nozzle to come out the front of the airbrush. So let me just clean this out real quick. Usually to clean out my airbrush, I use a couple paper towels, stuff them into a cup, and at first I'll pour out a little bit in there. Whoop. And this leads me into a couple things you need to know before you start actually spraying paint. So, using acrylic paints, your airbrush is going to want to clog all the time. Acrylic paints are probably one of the worst things you can put through your airbrush. Of course, in our hobby, we all use acrylic paints. So how do we get around it clogging all the time? Well, first off, when you first get your airbrush, hook it up to your air supply and spray it onto your hand. Get to know exactly how hard or exactly how that air feels on your arm with your airbrush being completely clean. This will kind of tell us if our airflow is impeded or if it's good. So I'm always spraying on my hand just to make sure that the air is forceful enough. The other thing that I do is I put some water in my cup, and I'll take another cup with a paper towel in it, and I'll spray into that. Now, as you can see, there's a nice cone of spray. It's perfectly round and it's very forceful, just like that. That's a perfectly clean airbrush. So now I know how the air feels on my hand when it's brand new. I also know what water looks like going through the airbrush when my airbrush is clean. So now as I'm airbrushing, if I start feeling that my air doesn't hit my hand as hard, or I start noticing that when I go to clean out my airbrush, that maybe that spray is not as big as that. Or you'll also notice the spray kind of like gets smaller as I hold it down. So if I'm spraying it and it starts getting like undulating back and forth, that tells me that something's starting to clog in my airbrush. So that's my first line of defense. We know what the spray looks like, and we also know that the trigger is tight against this little back mechanism that helps pull back the needle. So if our trigger starts getting a little jiggly like this, that's a sign that our needle's being pulled back into the airbrush. If our needle starts traveling backwards into the airbrush, we know that the clog is starting to develop in this area right here. Let me take the tip off of this. So this is our nozzle. Let me take the needle out too. So this is our nozzle. It's small, but it's fairly big compared to the Sotars, which I'll show you in a minute, which is really teeny tiny. But this is our nozzle. And what happens is as paint starts building up on the inside edges of this nozzle, it starts making it so our needle can't rest fully forward in our nozzle. So if the needle starts traveling backwards, that's a sign that, the inside of our nozzle is clogging. The other sign is your trigger starts getting a little bit loose. So those are two signs that things are clogging inside of our nozzle. The most important part of your airbrush is your nozzle. So I have friends that clean everything but the nozzle, and their airbrush is constantly clogged. So if you keep the inside of the nozzle clean, your airbrush will spray paint no problem all the time. So I've gotten to the point where I don't clog anymore because I'm constantly cleaning that nozzle. That being said, keep track of how far your needle comes out of the nozzle. So when this airbrush is brand new, on a Patriot 105, your needle should come out about 1/8 of an inch from the tip of the nozzle. If it's shorter than that, then that means I have a clog happening in the nozzle. So another way to tell if your nozzle is clogging, you'll have little bubbles inside your cup. And that's just indicative of the nozzle clogging up, and now air isn't allowed to go out the airbrush. It's coming backwards in the airbrush and making little bubbles in your cup. Bubbles will usually be caused first by what's called dry tip. So the tip of your needle will start drying out. The paint will actually start sticking to it and all that. Badger makes a product called Needle Juice, and it helps mitigate that dry tip, but the dry tip will always happen. So what I've just done is every miniature or 2 miniatures, I just always scrape off the tip of my needle. It keeps the dry tip from collecting, and it keeps me from having the bubbles in my cup, and it also keeps me from having the nozzle clog prematurely. Another way to tell if your nozzle is clogging is your spray pattern will make it like a D shape. Instead of being a full cone, it will be cut in half, and it'll be like one side will be spraying, the other side spraying nothing. And what that is your nozzle has clogged on one side or the other, but it's still letting paint out the other side. So what happens is it will make your needle rest further back, and when you press on the trigger, paint will actually spray out without pulling back on the trigger, and that's not good. It's also a sign of a clog. So my first combat to that is do a couple hard sprays. The second thing I can do is loosen up my needle, pull it back just a little bit, and I recommend not pulling it back real far. I used to pull it back way far like this and then spray my hard sprays. The problem is that pulls paint all the way back through your airbrush. So you never want paint back in here by the trigger. So what I do is I pull the needle back maybe 1/8 of an inch, spray it real hard onto a piece of paper. Sometimes I actually hear the paint fly out, push it back in, or maybe kind of juice it a little bit, in and out, tighten down my needle, and do another hard spray. Usually this will get the clog out. If that doesn't work, I'm gonna have to clean out my whole airbrush, take it all apart, and clean the nozzle out myself by hand. So to do that, I take my nozzle cover off all the way, pull the nozzle out, and I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to scrape the inside of the nozzle. By scrape, I don't mean scrape, I just mean gently rub the inside of my nozzle. So what this does is I can get any of the paint that's collected inside the nozzle, I can scratch it out basically. And there's no better feeling than your airbrush is a little bit clogged and you do this scraping out of the nozzle and this little black fleck of paint comes out and you know, oh my gosh, I got it. I got that clog. If you don't do this, your nozzle will continue to clog, and sometimes it takes a month or two before it completely clogs. If your nozzle completely clogs, it will start pushing paint back through your airbrush. And it will end up back in your trigger. You'll have paint dripping out the back trigger assembly. You'll have to clean the back of your airbrush more often. All those things. These are all bad things, and it causes your airbrush to work even worse. And so if you just simply keep the nozzle clean, you won't have to worry about any of the back workings of your airbrush. Another little part I want you to check out, if you're noticing that your airflow is not spraying as hard as it was in the past, that has nothing to do with your nozzle being clogged. That has everything to do with your airflow being clogged. So, a couple ways this can happen. Either A, paint collects on the tip of the nozzle guard right out here, and will start collecting. A little bit doesn't matter. A lot of it does matter. It will actually close the hole that's right there. So if that happens, paint will start spraying back into the inside of this cover, which means there'll be paint on the inside edges, which will impede your airflow. There will also get paint down in these little bitty holes here on the nozzle cover. If those holes get filled up, even just one of them partially, it will mess up the entire way that your airflow comes out. Badger has created like a vortex where the air comes out and spins around inside this cap. And if even one of those is clogged or partially clogged, it will make the vortex wobbly and you won't airbrush properly. Also, your air pressure will go down drastically, and so now you're clogging more, you won't have good spray, all those things. So every time I clean the airbrush, at the end of the day, I'll clean the inside of this. I'll also clean the holes and make sure that I can see through them. If you can't, you can always use your needle to kind of poke it out, make sure there's no ink in there or paint in there, and you should be good to go. So typically I don't have a problem with that getting clogged, but when I first started airbrushing, it happened a lot. So make sure that nozzle doesn't get clogged, make sure that your dry tip doesn't overwhelm the outside edges of this and end up clogging your airflow. And you should be good to go for all your airbrushing in the future. So to put this back together, I'll put the rear assembly on, and this is basically the needle guard. Put my needle through here. One of the things I really like about Badger products or Badger airbrushes is that on the Patriot 105 and the Sotar 2020, you can access the needle without taking off the rear guard. If you have to take off the rear guard, a lot of people you'll see airbrushing like this, which is fine until you're like me and you drop it and break this back part, which nobody carries, and then you're out of commission for 2 months. So having this back assembly on keeps my airbrush safe. I can quickly unlock that, pull the needle in and out when I need to, and I'm good to go. So this airbrush is ready to go. Let's take a quick look at a higher end airbrush, the Sotar 2020. Again, this airbrush I only use with inks, and you may be asking yourself, how do I know it's an ink? They say ink on the bottle, so that's an easy way to tell if it's an ink or not. Inks are made to go through airbrushes, and they're made to go through high-end airbrushes, so they have a tendency not to clog as much, which is really nice. They're also very easy to clean out of your airbrush. So I only use inks on my Sotar 2020. So any airbrush with a 0.2 needle or less, I only use inks on. I only use acrylics. Well, I use acrylics and inks, but I generally don't use inks as much because I have my Sotar 2020. So using my acrylics on the Badger is the Patriot 105. Because it has a larger needle, it will clog less and it works better for those colors. On my Sotar 2020, since it's a more high-end airbrush, you have to be a little bit more careful with your needle. The needle will bend a lot easier than your Patriot 105, so just be a little more vigilant. When I'm scraping the needles, I'm very careful and just lightly scrape the needle off with my fingernails. You can also use cotton swabs or whatever, but be careful of the needle because it bends very easily. So you want to keep that needle straight. On the Sotar, I'll show you the difference here. The parts are much more delicate. So I'm going to take off the needle cover. This is the area where you got to make sure that airflow is not impeded by any paint or anything. And then if you actually take the needle cover or the nozzle cover off, That is the nozzle. It's super small. If I drop this right now, it's over. I will not be able to find it. So you got to be really careful. The problem is to clean these, to clean out the inside of the nozzle is the same process. So this is the part where I stab myself a lot during the day, cleaning out the inside of that nozzle. Again, I'm not scraping hard, just real lightly. Make sure that it's clean. I think that nozzle is perfectly clean. So I'll put it all back together. It's important that you put this nozzle on first, then the nozzle cover. Believe it or not, these Sotards, you can put the nozzle in after this piece and your airbrush won't work. So just be careful that you put it in the right order. Put the nozzle cover on here. Get that on good. I always push my needle down and make sure it bounces back up. That means it's seated correctly. Because as you can see, our trigger has a little hole in it. If it's resting up too high, when I put the needle in, it will hit that solid area and bend the needle. So I want to make sure that it's exactly in the spot that it needs to be. So if it's not, I can't push down on that trigger. So move it around, find where it's supposed to go. Now that's in the right spot. So now I can put my needle in. Put it in real slowly, just kind of tap it in. I just tap it to make sure it's seated correctly in front there. Lock that down. I'm gonna put a little bit of water in and spray it out. Looking at my spray again, I remember from when it was new, that's a perfect spray. This airbrush is totally clean. Give one more spray. All right. So that's it on our first installment of airbrushes. We've talked about the air compressor, we've talked about our airbrush and how to clean it, how to keep it clog free. Stay tuned next time when we go over how to thin your paints and how to airbrush a miniature. Thanks again for watching.